A poor girl living in the woods unexpectedly saved the life of a millionaire who had a cardiac arrest while volunteering. Thinking she was being repaid, a few days later, he made the girl burst into tears because, "Don't wander too far from the safe zone." The call echoed steadily from the far end of the camp, like an old song playing on repeat. One of the three caretakers stood with her hands on her hips under the shade of a maple tree, squinting into the glaring sun, trying to keep an eye on the children disappearing into tall grass. The early autumn breeze stirred gently, just enough to tousle the already messy hair of a little boy tying his shoelaces with dirt-stained hands. "Don't let them go down to the stream," another woman said, her voice flat, eyes fixed on her phone as she scrolled through the lunch plan. On a carefully leveled patch of land, picnic tables were arranged in a U-shape. Simple food was laid out: veggie sandwiches, red apples, juice boxes, homemade cookies, and in the center, a larger table covered with a cloth printed with the logo of the charity Brighter Roots, which served children from city orphanages. "Mr. Edward is like my grandpa used to be, but cleaner." A cheeky little boy grinned, whispering to his friend as he watched the man set food on the table. "He's not like my grandpa. Mine only knew how to fish, but this one knows how to smile at us. He even ate grilled sausages with us." A girl in a red dress chimed in, cheeks puffed up with laughter. No one had told them to, but the children gradually grew fond of the man, not because he was wealthy. They didn't really grasp what that meant, but because he always listened and never interrupted anyone. Sitting at the head of the table, bathed in golden sunlight, was Edward Grayson, the man who had organized today's charity outing. He wore a white button-down shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had lived through much, but his eyes were unexpectedly gentle, as if always ready to listen. He didn't speak much, just smiled, and that smile, as one girl had put it earlier, it's like the kind of smile in church paintings, not because it's pretty, but because it's warm. A boy crept up to him, holding out a shiny red apple. "You should eat this." Edward looked, then chuckled. "Thank you, kiddo, but only really good people get to eat an angel's apple, right?" The boy nodded, stuffed the apple into his hand, and ran off, grinning from ear to ear. A woman standing behind the table, Isabel, Edward's trusted assistant, looked on with approval. She double-checked the guest list and murmured something to a man in a dark suit. "The press will be here soon. They need to see how kind he really is." Across the table, Dr. Allen, responsible for monitoring Edward's health, walked up holding a glass bottle. "Mr. Edward, it's time." Edward took it without looking at the label. "Still smells the same as yesterday." Exactly the same. Herbs, mixed the old way. He took a sip, set the bottle down, then nodded at the kids lining up for their meals. A soft chuckle escaped him when a little girl slipped and plopped down on the grass, still triumphantly holding her cookie box aloft. Just a few seconds later, a dry crack rang out as the glass bottle fell and shattered on the table. Edward froze, one hand clutching his chest. The color drained from his face, turning from rosy to ashen. His eyes widened, as if trying to focus on something, then fell shut. He collapsed sideways, knocking over a chair. People shot to their feet. Screams erupted. Children shrieked. One little boy clung to a caretaker's leg. The girls began to cry loudly. The camp staff fumbled with their phones, hands trembling too much to dial. The wealthy guests who had joined Edward for the charity event went pale, rushing to check on him. They looked lost. This was more difficult than navigating a crashing stock market. Alan stood a few steps away, hand gripping the back of a chair. His eyes swept the scene, pausing briefly on Isabel before he quietly stepped back. No one saw him make a call. No one saw him check the patient. It didn't seem like he intended to intervene. A man in a suit, perhaps a business associate, ran over and began administering CPR, then gently propped Edward up against the base of an old tree. He's still breathing, probably low blood pressure. Let's just keep him alert. Someone bring some candy. No, no! His heart beats irregular, a woman cried. The children gathered in a terrified huddle. Some cried, some covered their ears, some just stood frozen, wide-eyed, and in the middle of that chaos, a small figure stepped forward. Lucy. About 12 years old, with dark brown hair tied with a piece of twine. Her indigo dress was patched in several places, her feet muddy, but her eyes disturbingly alert. No one could stop her. She walked straight to where Edward lay trembling, pulling a small fabric pouch from her side. "Move aside," she said. "What are you doing?" An adult barked, but she didn't answer. Lucy knelt. Her small hands gently pressed Edward's neck, checking his pulse. Her eyes locked on his lips, dry, rimmed with a bluish tint. "Poison," she murmured. "Not low blood pressure." She took out a small vial and dropped a few pale yellow drops into Edward's mouth. With her other hand, she pressed firmly between his upper lip and nose. Then, as quick as lightning, she pulled out a handful of dried leaves from her pouch, chewed them into a pulp, and placed it under his tongue. "Give me some water." A young girl hurriedly handed her a bottle of filtered water. Lucy simply tilted Edward's head and let the water drip gently like rain into the corner of his mouth. Edward's body twitched. Then he vomited. A stream of dark brown liquid poured out, clinging to his chin and staining his white shirt with splotches. "Someone help me lay him down," she said. At first, the people around were skeptical, but as they watched Edward retch out the poisonous fluid, their doubt turned into belief. 2 men stepped forward and gently laid him down. The grassy lawn became the millionaire's new bed. She kept her hand on his chest, feeling for each heartbeat. Her eyes didn't blink. Alan returned and froze at the scene. "What is going on here? Who gave permission?" "That girl saved him," a woman's voice said, just as the sound of an approaching ambulance filled the air. Edward opened his eyes, cloudy, dim, but he reached out, grasping Lucy's hand. His lips trembled as he forced out each word. "Let the girl... come along." Lucy sat in the ambulance. Her hands were sticky with plant resin, eyes still fixed on Edward's hand. His face was pale, but his breathing had grown steadier. Alan rode in a separate vehicle behind them, silent. Isabel whispered something into her phone. A few children stood by the fence, watching them go. "Who is she?" "Like Tarzan's daughter." "Did that jungle girl really save him?" one of them whispered. "Yeah, I saw it clearly." "She's... strange." The ambulance rushed through the pine forest. The wind stirred the leaves, creating a rustling sound, like a silent blessing. The smell of disinfectant in the hospital lobby wrapped around everything, like an invisible cloak. Even around the worry. It wasn't pungent, but persistent, stretching across each footstep, slipping into the darkest corners of the hallway, lined with green carpet. A gurney rolled past, its wheels rattling on the floor. At the same moment, at least 10 pairs of eyes turned to the girl walking behind it. Lucy. Barefoot, wearing a patched-up dress, clutching a faded fabric bag with frayed handles. Dried medicinal leaves still clung beneath her fingernails. A flake of dried mud stuck to the hem of her skirt. Her hair was wild, but her eyes were wide, clear, and unflinching. A nurse stepped back and whispered to her colleague, "Heavens, who let her into this area?" "This is the VIP wing." The other leaned in. "They said she's an acquaintance of the patient. Apparently, she just saved some millionaire. She's a street kid, that's what she is." Lucy heard it, not because they spoke loudly, but because the contempt in their voices wasn't hidden. Still, she didn't react. She kept walking, eyes fixed on Edward's gurney being wheeled into the intensive care unit. "Stop right there," a cold female voice rang out. A middle-aged woman dressed in designer clothes, heels clicking, a sparkling Hermes handbag on her arm. She blocked the hallway, pointing at Lucy. "What is she doing here?" "This is the VIP area. We can't let some filthy jungle child contaminate the air in this place." The hallway froze. Some lowered their heads, avoiding her glare. Others huddled together and whispered. Alan, walking behind, seized the moment. "I've said this from the start. This girl isn't medical staff. She hasn't had any training. Who does she think she is? Saving people with forest leaves? What if Mr. Edward had died because of her?" A young nurse nearby raised her head. But he didn't die, because she acted while everyone else was still frozen. "She's right." An elderly patient in a wheelchair sat up, straining forward. "I saw it. That man was still whispering thanks to her as they brought him in." Silence fell like a curtain. Alan pressed his lips together and turned away. The woman in designer clothes scoffed, pulling out her phone and stepping back. Lucy still said nothing. She quietly moved closer to the wall, clutching her bag tightly. The scent of antiseptic mixed with the echo of footsteps, bouncing like echoes in a deep cave. She didn't understand why they were so angry. She had only done what needed to be done, just like her grandmother had taught her. If you can save a life, then do it. You don't need anyone's permission. A doctor in a white coat stepped out from the emergency area, glancing around before calling out loudly. "Little girl. Sorry, I don't know your name. Mr. Edward, he's awake. He asked for you." Everyone in the hallway turned. Alan froze but said nothing. A few people murmured quietly. Lucy stood still, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "Come on, dear." The doctor motioned. Lucy walked slowly. Every step echoed in her heart. She had never stepped into a wealthy patient's room before. Everything here was white to the point of coldness, pristine to the point of being emotionless. So different from the rickety wooden house clinging to the mountainside where she lived. The automatic door opened. Inside was Edward, lying still, an IV in the back of his hand, the ventilator humming steadily. A reading lamp cast a soft yellow light over his face, pale, but his eyes were just the same, calm, deep, and strangely gentle. He turned his head and saw Lucy. "Come closer." His voice was hoarse, but firm. Lucy came to the bedside, still holding her cloth bag. Edward reached out and touched her hand, cold but strong. "Thank you for being there." Lucy looked up. She was about to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "I just did what my grandma used to do." "Your grandma must have been a good person." She said, "If we're doing the right thing, there's no need to be afraid." Edward smiled faintly. He closed his eyes for a second as if gathering strength. "Stay with me, will you? At least until I'm fully recovered. Calling you little girl doesn't feel right, does it? What's your name?" "Lucy, sir." The girl answered softly, very different from the fierce girl who had saved him that morning. Edward smiled and nodded. "Edward, pleased to meet you." Out in the hallway, Alan leaned against the wall, looking through the glass. His expression darkened as he saw Edward holding the girl's hand. A few hours later, in a private waiting room in the guest wing, Lucy sat at a wide wooden table. On the table were a cup of tea, some biscuits, and a brand new set of children's books. A polite housekeeper bowed slightly. "Mr. Grayson asked us to prepare a room for you. If you need anything, just let us know." Lucy looked around. The ceiling was high, the curtains thick, the scent of lavender faint. She didn't know where she belonged, but for the first time in days, she felt safe. Late autumn in Boston brought a strange kind of light, not radiant, not cold, just a soft warmth like mist wrapping around everything. The small garden behind Graceland Hospital, reserved for special patients, was neatly trimmed, though a few stubborn yellow leaves refused to be swept away by the wind. That afternoon, Edward sat on an oak bench, a blanket over his knees. His eyes followed Lucy as she rummaged through her bag and took out a few brown, earthy-looking seeds. "These are wild grapes. Grandma said brewing them into tea warms your belly and helps you sleep. I kept them in my coat pocket, all along," the girl said, turning the tiny grapes between her fingers. Edward took one and raised it to his nose. "How long have you and your grandma lived in the forest?" "Over 5 years, since I was 6. Grandma said, 'Too many people in the city. Easy to get lost.'" He smiled. "Getting lost among people. Turns out, it's harder than getting lost in the forest." They sat in silence for a while. The faint sound of a distant ambulance was like the cicadas of late summer. Lucy sat beside him, eyes fixed on the grass at her feet. "Mr. Edward." "Yes? I saw something the day you collapsed." He tilted his head toward her, waiting. Lucy lowered her gaze, pulling a sprig of mint from her pocket, pretending to fiddle with it between her fingers. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That day, just after you fell, I saw Dr. Allen and your secretary standing not far away. They were whispering about stocks and a timely departure. Like maybe things would be better for someone if you didn't make it." Edward was silent. His eyes narrowed slightly. The lines at the corners of his eyes seemed even more deeply etched. "You heard clearly?" His voice was steady. Lucy nodded. "I was standing very close, so they didn't know I was there." Edward nodded slowly. Then he gave a faint smile, light as a breeze. "Maybe you misheard. Or maybe they were talking about something else. Stocks, you know. Finance people often say things like that." Lucy didn't reply. She let out a quiet breath, but her eyes couldn't hide the disappointment. "I just wanted you to know, even though I'm not sure what it means." Edward placed his hand over hers. "Thank you. Truly." Isabel closed the office door of the hospital, holding the strap of her expensive beige handbag, her eyes sweeping the room as if checking for dust. She sat down opposite Edward and exhaled softly. "I know you're fond of the girl, but you should think carefully." Edward lifted his teacup but didn't drink. "What do you mean?" "That girl, she has no papers, no guardian, lives in the woods. Chances are she's here illegally. People will start asking questions. And you're a public figure. You think people will be upset because I let a child sleep under my roof?" Isabel tilted her head slightly. "Not everyone sees the way you do. I just want to remind you of your image, your position." Edward set the teacup down without a sound. "All right, I'll think about it." The next morning, Lucy returned to the treehouse. It nestled beneath the golden canopy of maple leaves. A few wooden planks slightly askew, a rope ladder made of bark dangling loosely. She had just rekindled the wood stove and was gently blowing on the tea leaves when she heard footsteps on the ladder below. Edward. He wore a long coat, a wool scarf around his neck, and carried a paper bag in one hand. "I'm guessing this place feels more like home than anywhere else in the world, doesn't it?" Lucy looked surprised. "You found the way." "Easy. You described it well, and I asked a few people at the hospital." They sat on the wooden floor, surrounded by jars of dried herbs. Edward opened the paper bag, a soft loaf of bread, a thermos of ginger tea, and 2 handwriting practice books. "I know you're not used to crowds, but if you agree, I'd like you to stay at my house for now, at least until we find somewhere safer. I'm trying to get in touch with child protection centers to find you a new home." Lucy looked at him, hesitant. "I'm not used to fancy places, and I don't want to trouble you." Edward shrugged. You don't have to be used to it. I just need you to be safe, and you're not troubling me at all. I live alone. Having you around would be lovely, especially after you saved me. The girl looked away. I'm afraid of losing this place. You can come back any time. Silence. The wind rustled through the leaves. The scent of burning bark drifted in through the wooden slats. At last, Lucy nodded. Okay, but only for now. That afternoon, Edward's villa opened its doors to a child of the woods. From the second floor, Isabel looked down, her gaze growing colder as Lucy stepped across the threshold. One hand gripped the railing tightly. Below, Edward bent down slightly to guide Lucy in, smiling gently. Your room is on the ground floor. There's a window looking out to the garden. If you don't like it, we can change it. Lucy didn't answer, only nodded softly. Before her was a strange new world. Velvet-covered chairs, heavy drapes, silent paintings on the wall. The scent of polished wood, not like dried leaves, not like the smoke of a forest stove. That night, they ate together. Lucy fumbled with the fork, but Edward didn't laugh. He simply guided her gently. When she slipped and dropped a piece of bread, he picked it up and said, "No problem. I once spilled an entire bowl of soup on a dinner guest." Lucy burst out laughing, and then she stopped being shy. 2 weeks passed. Lucy began tending the backyard garden, replanting a few rosemary bushes. Edward read books, wrote letters by hand, and each evening he taught her to read from the handwriting practice books. She learned quickly, wrote beautifully, and even knew how to brew tea to just the right warmth, a skill Edward found as delightful as a little magic trick. But outside that warm house, Isabel had begun digging into records from orphanages around New Hampshire, checking the lists of unregistered children. She had her private lawyer search for information on Lucy Green, living in the woods. No results. Alan, after being absent for several days, returned on a rainy morning. He brought with him 3 prescriptions, a new detox bottle, and his usual cold expression. "Edward, I've adjusted the formula. Your body needs to readapt gradually." Edward nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the window, where Lucy was playing with a small squirrel that had just climbed onto the sill. Every morning at the Grayson estate began with the smell of toasted bread, the soft hiss of boiling water in the kettle, and the light footsteps of Lucy on the wooden floor. She often rose earlier than Edward, went out to the garden to pick a few sprigs of mint, then brewed tea the way Mrs. Esther had once taught her. Let the water just start to ripple. If it boils too much, it'll kill the flavor. The house had always been quiet, but since Lucy arrived 2 months ago, the air had changed. Even the sunlight filtering through the white curtains seemed gentler. That morning, as usual, Lucy brought a tray of tea to Edward's room. "I brewed the mint tea a little longer today. Try it." Edward leaned back in his chair, still half asleep. He gave a slight nod, took the cup, sipped, then smiled. "The taste is just right. Like drinking something you once remembered, but can't quite name." Lucy set the tray down on the table by the bed. "Do you want me to trim your nails? I noticed the other day they were getting a bit long." Edward agreed. Lucy pulled a small nail clipper from her pocket and moved a chair closer to him. When she lifted his hand, the first thing she noticed was that his skin felt colder than usual. Then the nails, not pink as before. Instead, they were pale, thin, with 2 long black streaks running from base to tip. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. "Do you feel tired? Like dizzy or nauseous?" Edward chuckled, followed by a soft cough. "You sound like a doctor, but no, just a bit weary. Alan said it's stress. A lot going on lately." Lucy nodded but said nothing more. After trimming his nails, She gathered the clippings into a small piece of paper and folded it carefully. On her way out, she stole a glance at the medicine cabinet, where Alan usually kept the blister packs and detox bottles. That afternoon, while Edward was on the phone in his study, Lucy quietly opened the medicine cabinet. She took a few packs, slipped them into a cloth pouch, then locked the cabinet again. A breeze whistled through the crack in the door, as if warning her not to linger. She intended to give the pills to Nurse Sarah, the one who had once protected her at the hospital. Sarah had said, "If you ever need to have medicine checked or anything, just tell me. We've got a small lab for special drugs." Lucy trusted her. Late afternoon. Edward and Lucy sat together in the garden. He was telling a story about the first time he was rejected for an investment. His voice slow, but laced with humor. "And then they told me, 'We don't believe a 24-year-old understands the market better than we do.'" Lucy laughed. "And then? And then the next year, the company I invested in tripled in value, and they invited me to come on as an advisor." Edward was about to continue when he suddenly stopped. His hand clutched his chest, eyes shut tight, breath ragged. Lucy panicked. "Sir!" She rushed over, helped him back into the chair. Her hands trembled, but she stayed in control, pried open his mouth, checked his tongue, pressed gently on the philtrum. "Breathe with me. Can you do that?" No response. Lucy knelt and began chest compressions rhythmically. With each attempt at resuscitation, she whispered something that sounded almost like calling out. Passers-by began to gather. A middle-aged woman rushed into the yard shouting, "What's going on?" Lucy didn't stop. "Call an ambulance, hurry!" A man immediately pulled out his phone, dialing. A young man stepped forward to help support Edward's head. Minutes later, a siren blared at the end of the street. Lucy sat in the ambulance, her hand tightly gripping Edward's. His palm was ice cold. She leaned in close and whispered, "You're going to be okay. I'm right here." In the hospital hallway, Isabel and Alan walked side by side, just as Edward's stretcher passed by. Isabel immediately pulled Alan aside. "What now?" "He was just getting better." Alan frowned, voice low. "What do you think? His body's weaker than we thought. I'll check the medication again." Isabel shot him a glare. "Check or adjust the dose again." No one answered. Behind the glass panel, Lucy stood watching Edward being wheeled into the emergency room. Her hand clenched tightly around a fabric pouch. Inside were the blister packs of pills she had secretly taken from the cabinet. She knew something was killing him, slowly and surely. And she knew that this time, no one could just say it was stress anymore. At the end of the cardiology wing of Graceland Hospital was a small, isolated room, once used for storing records. Tall shelves stretched to the ceiling, packed with brown, worn files, silent, like forgotten witnesses. That was where Josh Murphy, the newly appointed head of cardiology, walked in the next morning after taking over Edward Grayson's case. Murphy, 42, was quiet and sharp-minded. He didn't trust anyone's word without seeing for himself. Last night, when he reviewed Edward's blood test results, he had to triple-check. The concentration of ephedrine, a rare compound with direct effects on the cardiovascular system, was 10 times the safe limit. A completely illogical finding in a man not being treated with any related medication. "Do we have this patient's old medical records?" Murphy asked his assistant the following morning. "We do, but most old records have been moved to the archives. I can look." Murphy went with her personally. Under the dim, fluorescent lights, he navigated through the catalogue, finally stopping at a thick stack of files on the back shelf, labelled in red, "Pending Destruction." Inside, one file bore the name Edward Grayson. Its pages scribbled with messy handwritten notes. The final page clearly stated, "Signs of ephedrine accumulation, monitor further. No one had followed up. At the same time, in the hospital's rest area, Lucy approached Nurse Sarah. It was the morning shift, and Sarah had just finished washing her hands when she saw Lucy standing at the end of the hallway, holding the fabric pouch. Lucy, right? Mr. Grayson's granddaughter. What's going on? Lucy opened the pouch and took out several blister packs. Nurse Sarah, I don't know what these pills are called, but Mr. Edward takes them every day. I think something's wrong. Sarah took the packs, read the labels, and frowned. I'll bring these to the internal testing lab, but just from a glance, these seem to be in the group containing ephedrine derivatives. Lucy nodded. My grandma once treated someone with symptoms like his. They grew weaker and then had heart issues. I remember very clearly. That afternoon, Murphy entered Edward's room. He lay still, his face pale, but his eyes were open, alert. Mr. Grayson, I'm Dr. Josh Murphy. I'll be your attending physician starting today. Edward gave a faint nod. I need you to see this, Murphy said, opening the file. This is your blood test from yesterday. The ephedrine levels are dangerously high. And your medical records from 6 months ago were moved to the destruction list, along with a warning note. But no one informed you. Edward stared at the page, silent. His eyes slowly closed, as if something had come back to him. When this story reached you, had you finished dinner? If so, comment popcorn. If not, write snacks. When he opened them again, his voice was hoarse. I suppose someone didn't want me to know. That evening, Sarah secretly led Lucy into the records archive. They wore headlamps and sifted through piles of files. After nearly 2 hours, Lucy stopped at a health checkup file. She pointed to the signature on the last page. Look at this. The signature, Alan Brown, doesn't match the others. Sarah leaned in close, comparing each stroke. This one's forged. Maybe signed by an assistant or someone trying to impersonate him. Lucy stayed silent. Her eyes gazed out the small window, where only a few streetlights could be seen. We're close to the truth, but one piece is still missing. In his room, Edward looked out at the night. His hand reached under the blanket's edge. His mind echoed with moments. Alan avoiding his gaze, offering increasingly vague medical advice. Isabel, always organizing meetings, hinting at changing signatory rights for the charity fund. It was all unraveling. And now, thanks to the quiet observation of a forest child, the curtain had lifted. Graceland at night was silent, as if the whole world were wrapped in a layer of grey velvet. In Edward's hospital room, the bedside lamp cast a soft glow across his face, the same face once seen on the cover of Forbes, titled, "The Man Who Created Miracles for Nameless Children." But now, those eyes were heavy, not just with illness. At a small table near the window, Edward carefully flipped through each account statement of the Grayson Foundation. The charitable organization he had devoted a portion of his life to building. The numbers, the columns of expenses, every comma, every date, all seemed ordinary, unless one paid attention to their true purpose. "Conference costs in Geneva," he murmured. "I didn't approve anything for that month." He circled it with a red pen, then moved on to another entry. "Shipping costs for medicinal herbs from overseas." Isabel had once been in charge of the import records for those products, supposedly under the pretext of testing new methods for treatment centers in remote areas. But the detailed report only noted that the goods never arrived. There were no receipts or confirmations from any partners. At the same time, down the hospital hallway, Lucy sat in Nurse Sarah's office. On the desk was a tablet showing a segment of video footage from the hospital's security cameras. Sarah pointed at a particular frame. "Here, that's him, Dr. Alan, carrying the detox bottle, then switching the label just before entering Mr. Edwards' room. "Look closely, Lucy. The image is blurry, but you can clearly see the motion." Lucy clenched her fists. "That was before he collapsed, right?" Sarah nodded. At the far end of the corridor, Alan appeared as usual, immaculately dressed, hair slicked back, white lab coat pressed without a crease. He knocked on Edward's door, carrying a new box of medication. "Edward, I've adjusted the dosage slightly. Your body needs to readapt. I think it would be better to continue with this." Murphy walked in almost immediately after. "Sorry, but I've ordered a full stop on all current medications. Nothing goes in without my direct approval." Alan turned, still smiling. "I'm just doing my job. Edwards trusted me for 10 years. Murphy didn't smile. "And that nearly killed him." Alan froze. He set the medication box on the table and turned to leave. In his eyes, something dark flickered, but vanished just as quickly. That afternoon, Isabel offered a suggestion in a tone laced with concern. "Edward, I think you should rest somewhere quieter. There's a rehabilitation center in Vermont, peaceful, private, and safe. The press won't be able to bother you there." Murphy overheard and immediately objected. "He needs close monitoring at the hospital. Moving him now is far too risky." Isabel gave a forced smile. "I'm only thinking of his health." Edward nodded, saying nothing. But beneath the table, his hand quietly pressed the power button of a small recording device Lucy had slipped into his coat pocket the day before. That night, Alan entered the senior staff lounge. Thinking he was alone, he made a call. "Yes. I switched the label like you said. He's still clueless. As for the money, Isabel will handle it in time. No one's going to find out." Inside the coat, hanging near the desk, the recorder was still running. When he left, Lucy slipped in and retrieved it. She handed it to Edward the following morning. "I'm not sure if it's enough, but maybe you should hear it." Edward listened in full, said nothing, but when he removed the earbuds, the blank look in his eyes was gone. They gleamed, quietly and deeply, like someone who had just recovered a lost memory. At Dr. Murphy's office, he handed over a copy of the recording, along with the medication records and surveillance images. Murphy nodded. "We have enough." And for the first time in weeks, Edward spoke, his voice firm and steady. "It's time to unmask them with the very things they used to deceive me." The hallway light quietly streamed through the window pane, casting the shadow of a maple leaf onto the gleaming white tiles. Room 312, where Edward Grayson was resting, remained slightly ajar. A faint mint scent drifted from the tea bag Lucy had just steeped, sitting on the bedside table. The room was so still, even the sound of turning a page echoed like a memory returning from far away. Edward was intently reading the medical journal Lucy had just begun writing. She recorded his blood pressure, temperature, skin tone, even the nuances of his facial expressions day by day. Her handwriting was neat, simple, but included words far beyond what a typical child might use. "You write very carefully," Edward said, setting the notebook down, his voice warm. Lucy pressed her lips together and smiled faintly. "I'm used to it. My grandmother used to teach me to take note of even the tiniest changes, especially when caring for someone with a high fever. Their skin color shifts bit by bit. There was one time she discovered someone had been poisoned just by looking into their eyes." Edward looked up at the girl. "Was your grandmother a nurse?" Lucy shook her head. When she was young, she worked as a maid. Later, she became a healer in our town. She was very good. Her name was Esther. Esther Green." The words dropped like a small pebble into a still lake. Edward froze. He gripped the armrest of the chair, leaned back slightly, eyes widening, as if a sudden beam of light had pierced through the dust of forgotten memory. Esther Green," he whispered, so softly Lucy barely heard. She nodded. "She lived with me since I was little. My parents died a long time ago, and she passed away last spring." Edward fell silent. One hand rested on his chest, not out of pain, but from deep astonishment. Slowly, he said, "When I was a boy, back at the old mansion in Vermont, there was a woman, Esther. She was the housekeeper. But to me, she was the only one who could get me to take medicine. The first to use boiled leaves to bring down my fever. Back then, I was terrified of the antibiotics the doctors gave me. When my family moved to the city, they said she should retire. I haven't seen her since I was 8. Lucy looked up. She used to tell me about a little master, very stubborn, refused to study, refused to sleep, only listened when she told forest stories. Edward gave a soft laugh, but his eyes were red. In the dim light, he reached out. Lucy hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His hand was dry, but warm. A connection once buried by time now pulsed alive between two souls. An old, lonely man and a girl who'd lived apart from the world. She brought you back to the place she once called home. And now you've saved my life, Edward said, as if only now realizing fate's quiet design. Lucy didn't answer. She just nodded, lips pressed tightly. Between them, something greater than gratitude, greater than blood, a debt of kindness stretching across 2 generations, had just been passed on. The light in the room dimmed as evening fell. Edward still didn't let go of Lucy's hand, as if afraid the moment might be a dream. But then he gently released her and stood, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. "Lucy," he said, "are you afraid? If we decide to overturn everything?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, pulled a small note from her pocket, the list of medications, the symbols she and Sarah had traced from the archives. She laid the paper on the table. "I am. But Grandma said, those who are right are often alone before they're believed." Edward looked down and nodded slightly. That night, in a small meeting room beside the administrative wing of the hospital, the lights were turned on for the first time in months. Edward's personal lawyer, Mr. Dorian James, sat at the head of the table, reviewing each file that Murphy, Lucy, and Sarah had gathered. A recording from a tiny device, 3 printed financial statements from the internal system, and a covert video of Isabel and Alan speaking near the quiet garden behind the hospital. "I'm not sure if this is enough for a lawsuit," Dorian said cautiously. "But for a public statement, internal investigation, and a formal warning, it's enough." Murphy nodded. "They tried to alter treatment plans, pushed for a hospital transfer. That's medical misconduct, and if the medication caused harm, it could be criminal." Lucy stood near the door, holding her familiar bag, not interrupting the adults. But when Edward looked her way, he knew. The greatest courage didn't come from documents or evidence, but from a girl who dared to speak the truth when no one else believed it. The next morning, Isabel came to Edward's room with a basket of imported fruit and a smile that was far too polite. "I just wanted to say, I'm worried about you. A lot of this is being blown out of proportion. Alan may have gone a bit too far, but you need someone who understands you. That girl will only stir things up." Edward didn't respond right away. He picked up an apple from the basket, turning it in his hand. "Are you worried for me or for yourself?" Isabel froze. "What do you mean?" He set the apple down, smiling. "You know, I'm still lucid enough to tell the difference between someone pretending to care and someone strangling me with sweet advice." Isabel opened her mouth, but couldn't say a word. He turned his back, walking slowly toward the window, morning light streaming in, casting over a back once burdened by solitude, now slowly standing straighter. That evening, Sarah, on duty in the nurses' station, noticed something odd. On the security monitor, Isabel and Alan stood close together in the courtyard behind the care home. Unaware the camera was still active, they faced each other. Alan spoke. "Just 10% left. Once the assets are fully moved into the sub-fund, he'll voluntarily step down." Isabel nodded. "As long as no one says anything about the last detox bottle. If he lives long enough to get suspicious." The plan's ruined. Sarah took out her phone and started recording. The clip lasted 37 seconds, just enough to destroy any possible defense. The next morning, Edward appeared at a closed-door meeting in the hospital's media room. For the first time in months, he wore a suit, not flashy or luxurious, but simple and firm. Beside him stood Murphy, Attorney Dorian, Lucy, and Sarah, a team as unusual as it was solid. He placed a recorder on the table and played the secret video. Then came the image of a forged signature copy, followed by a series of suspicious financial statements. One by one, like slices peeling back the familiar masks to reveal the true faces beneath. No flowery words, no tears. Just an old man saying, "I placed my trust in the wrong hands, and it nearly cost me my life. But thank God, I still have time to say this, to remind anyone who's ever been like me, don't overlook the little things and never let yourself be isolated by blind faith." The meeting didn't end with applause. It ended in silence, long and deep. A silence that, at times, echoed louder than any accusation. Lucy stood in the corner, saying nothing. But when Edward walked over and placed his hand on her shoulder, they both understood. From this moment on, they were no longer victims, but the ones who would decide where the light should shine. That morning, the Graceland Hospital's Grand Hall had been transformed into a temporary press conference room. Chairs neatly arranged, a podium draped in white cloth, lights from the ceiling beaming down on polished tile floors. Journalists and reporters from major newspapers and local TV stations were present. Cameras and lenses aimed at the podium, where a truth was waiting to be revealed. In the front row were some familiar faces: Edward's longtime associates, his foundation's executives, his lawyer, and most notably, a group of children who had once received scholarships brought in by guardians and teachers. The little ones sat upright, wide-eyed, hands clutching backpacks filled with breakfast snacks. 1 minute before the start, Edward appeared from behind the small stage. He wore a dark grey suit, his tie loosely knotted, his face slightly pale, but his eyes brighter than ever. Lucy walked beside him, holding onto the hem of his coat, not stepping back once. Together, they stepped onto the stage. The atmosphere dropped as Edward placed both hands on the microphone. He didn't look at the prepared script. He just took a deep, slow breath and began. "Thank you for coming. Today, I'm not speaking as a founder or a businessman, but as someone who just escaped death because of his own careless trust." The soft clicks of cameras echoed. Edward kept speaking, his voice steady, without dramatics, without anger, just a raw sincerity. "I once believed that those closest to me, the ones who cared for me, signed in my name, were the ones who would protect me. But in truth, sometimes greed finds its best hiding place behind the mask of loyalty." He turned to Murphy and nodded. The doctor stepped forward and gave a brief summary of the test results. Each number was displayed on the screen. Then Sarah played the hidden camera footage, Alan and Isabel talking in the garden, the clip where Alan said, "Just 10% left." A murmur swept through the room. A few Foundation executives frowned and exchanged glances. Edward continued. He laid 3 financial statements on the table, each clearly marked with forged signatures that matched altered prescriptions. Finally, he placed his hand on Lucy's shoulder, inviting her to step beside him. The girl trembled slightly, but didn't retreat. Edward leaned down and spoke into the microphone, softly yet clearly. This girl didn't just save my life. She saved my heart from stupidity and blindness. A breathless silence followed. Then applause broke out, not thunderous, but weighty, as if those witnessing felt something beyond the unmasking of wrongdoers, something like the revival of a long-forgotten value. At the back of the room, Isabel shot to her feet, her heavily made-up face visibly paled. She shouted, "It's not true! He set me up! They made it all up! That girl, she's a fake!" Alan backed into a corner, his face ashen. But when the police entered, his eyes turned to Lucy, not with rage or contempt, just the resigned look of someone who knew they'd been defeated by someone they never saw as a threat. A security officer approached. Isabel thrashed, trying to grab her phone back, but was restrained. Alan didn't resist. He gave a slight nod, almost as if relieved to be handcuffed. The two were led away, through orderly rows of chairs and flashing cameras that didn't stop. On stage, Edward bent down to wipe the sweat off Lucy's forehead, then held her hand, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, the forest girl, the one once called a street kid, stood in a grand hall under media lights, not trying to impress anyone, but simply being right where she belonged. Lucy didn't speak, but her tears fell quietly, not from pain, but because for the first time in her life, she was seen. She was heard. And in that moment, she became an irreplaceable part of a story about a man who seemed to have lost everything, but because of her, regained the one thing that mattered most: his faith in people. In the days following the press conference, Graceland Hospital felt as if a layer of dust had been washed away. Doors were left wide open to welcome the sunlight, and staff moved around with less silence. And in the familiar room, 312, Edward, still frail, had begun sitting up to read, play chess with Lucy, and listen to classical music every morning. Lucy came every day, carrying a box of hot soup and a few thin, dog-eared books, old books once kept by Grandma Esther. Each time she opened a page, she would read aloud a few passages, her voice not yet clear in every word, but tender enough to make Edward smile. One day, she brought an old cassette tape, recorded with her grandmother's voice telling bedtime stories, a trembling yet gentle sound. "Grandma said you used to like stories about foxes and bears. Do you remember?" Edward chuckled, then gave a soft cough. "Stories with foxes are usually about clever but lonely creatures, like I was when I was young." They no longer mentioned Alan or Isabel. There was no need. What needed to be said had been said before the public. Now was the time for healing. During that time, Sarah and Murphy had become like family. They brought fresh flowers every weekend and shared light dinners in the hospital room. Sarah taught Lucy how to write a health journal, while Murphy, when not on duty, played chess with Edward and lost most of the time. One afternoon, while Edward was sitting in the sun in the small courtyard, Lucy quietly asked, "If one day I had to leave here, would you be sad?" Edward didn't reply right away. He simply looked at her, then said plainly, "I haven't found any place more deserving of you than this one. So, why are you thinking of leaving?" Lucy lowered her head, fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "I'm afraid things will change again. I'm not used to being stable for too long." Edward didn't smile. He just placed a hand gently on her shoulder, holding it for a long time. "You don't need to be used to it. You only need to know. There is a place that won't change. It's called home." A week later, in the office of attorney Dorian James, Edward signed the adoption papers. Lucy sat beside him, eyes wide open. The legal documents didn't fully make sense to her, but his eyes and the way he said, "From now on, your full name will be Lucy Esther Grayson," made more sense than any document ever could. Dorian gave a quiet laugh as he closed the folder and said, I bet you never imagined your first adopted child would be a girl from the woods." Edward replied softly, eyes never leaving Lucy. "Not from the woods. From the heart." That afternoon, Edward and Lucy returned home. The old mansion, once cold and silent, now welcomed the sun through open windows. The kitchen smelled of baked goods, and the backyard had been cleared to replant mint and rosemary. Lucy ran into the garden, shouting with joy when she saw the seeds she'd planted had sprouted. "Can I go to school?" she asked over dinner that night. Edward nodded. "A small school, close by. They have an art class, literature, even a library. But you have to promise." "What?" "That every afternoon you'll still make mint tea for me, like always." Lucy burst out laughing, her laugh clear as a bell. She was no longer just a caretaker. She had become part of the rhythm of home. Yet she never forgot where she came from, the small wooden treehouse nestled under golden maple leaves. On weekends, Edward took her back there. They repaired the rope ladder, repainted some wooden panels. Lucy dusted off the old herb jars and placed Grandma Esther's photo back on the wooden table. On the wall, she hung a small sign that read, "The place where it began, the place to return." In a world that once seemed to shut its doors to Lucy, a new path had opened, one named family, not born of blood, but of trust, of human kindness, and of the courage to speak the truth when everyone else remained silent. From a distance, through the leaves lit by the late afternoon sun, Edward looked at her. He knew what once felt like a wound that would break him had now become his resurrection, together with a child and a dream reborn. The city had changed since those years. Towering buildings now gleamed with blue glass, the streets buzzed with activity, and people had become so busy they might forget anything that wasn't scheduled. Yet one morning, amid that rush, hundreds stopped before a new sign hanging on the white-painted facade of a 3-story building. From the deep forest to the city, Center for Homeless and Abandoned Children. Lucy Esther Grayson, now 26, stepped onto the stage in a small but warm auditorium. She wore a simple dress, her hair neatly tied back, no elaborate makeup. Her voice was still as gentle as when she was 12, but now stronger, deeper, and each word carried weight. There are children who were not born in hospitals, nor were they named by loved ones. They grew up among shrubs, beside tree trunks, with the wind as their lullaby and meals that were never certain. I was one of them. Lucy paused, her eyes looking down to the front row, where Edward sat between Murphy and Sarah. His hair had turned nearly white, but his eyes were full of life. Beside him sat children once helped by the Grayson Foundation, now grown, some in college, some teaching. But then, someone saw me, she continued. They didn't see a wild child, they saw a human being with a name, emotions, and dreams. They didn't just give me a home. They taught me how to see the children who are still invisible in this city. The entire hall fell silent. The spotlight cast a soft glow on the simple white backdrop behind her, where the words were printed, "From the deep forest to the city, bringing light to forgotten places." "And today, I choose to see them," she said, not with pity, but with belief. That we can bring these children from the forest, from the darkness and forgetfulness, into the city, not just in geography, but into the light. Behind Lucy, a large screen projected images, makeshift homes rebuilt from old wooden crates, small classrooms set up on the ground floor of a building, a mini garden with rows of carrots planted by the children themselves. The kids were smiling brightly, holding up drawings or jumping rope in a narrow courtyard. In another photo, Lucy was teaching a little girl how to bandage a small wound. Next to them, a messy scrawl on a board read, "Sister Lucy was the first to believe I could be good at something." Applause rose from the back of the room. Then it spread. Edward, seated among old friends, wiped his eyes. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, and Murphy gave a quiet nod, as if telling himself that no surgery could ever revive a heart as quickly as a once-forgotten girl just had. After the ceremony, the children rushed to Lucy, not like she was a founder or a leader, but like a sister, a refuge. One tugged on her shirt and asked, "Sister, did you used to live on the street too, like me?" Lucy bent down and smiled. "I used to be scared, even of crickets chirping at night. But then I learned to hear something else in their sound." "What sound?" "My own voice, when you're quiet long enough." Before leaving the center, Edward took Lucy's hand. "You've done what not everyone dares to do, used your own wounds to heal others." Lucy replied gently, "Because those very wounds helped me see who was hurting more." That evening, Lucy put on her old coat, slipped into the pair of shoes Aunt Esther had once patched up when she was 10, and quietly left the city. She took a bus to the outskirts of the state, once a small town, and deeper still, the old forest. She got off, walked nearly an hour, through grass slopes, past the narrow stream she used to know so well. The old maple tree was still there. The treehouse had collapsed, leaving just a few moss-covered planks. But the tree itself had grown, taller, stronger, greener than she remembered. Lucy placed her hand on the trunk, closed her eyes, said nothing. Only the wind responded, rustling through the leaves, brushing against her face like a gentle caress. In the wind, almost too faint to believe, was a whisper. "You did well, Lucy." Her aunt's voice, software kind, still the same. She sat down at the foot of the tree, pulled a small oil lamp from her backpack. She lit it and placed it before her. Night slowly fell, but it wasn't dark. No longer the darkness of abandonment, but a peaceful night, with a single small light deep in the forest. The light of hope, of a child once forgotten, now becoming the one who lights the way for others. And so, the story ends, not with applause, but with a quietly glowing lamp, bright enough to guide anyone who's still lost. Thank you for walking alongside Lucy and Edward through this journey, marked by wounds, but radiant with light. Perhaps somewhere deep within each of us, there was once a Lucy, small, lost, overlooked by society. And maybe we've also been Edward, strong on the outside, but fragile inside, placing trust in the wrong hands and nearly losing ourselves. This story is not just about rescue, it's about healing. It reminds us that love needs no official title, and that a hand extended at the right moment can change a life. If you ever feel unimportant or unseen, remember, someone out there is still waiting to touch your heart, just as Lucy touched Edward's. And if you have the chance, please be someone's Edward, not with power, but with trust and the patience to truly listen. Because sometimes, instead of asking, "Who will save me?" we can start with the question, "Who can I save today?" We hope today's story will leave you with a lot of emotions and make your day more meaningful.